The lecture hall of the Andorian Imperial Academy buzzed with the arrogant chatter of 57 different species, all convinced they were the apex of galactic civilization. Professor Keelar, a six-armed Exonian with more ego than sense, adjusted his crystalline monocle and sneered at the attendance roster. "Ah, wonderful," he announced, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could melt durasteel. "Another human has graced us with their primitive presence. Class, please welcome Terra Prime exchange student, Sarah Blackthorne." The door hissed open, and in walked what appeared to be the most unremarkable specimen of humanity the galaxy had ever bothered to acknowledge. Short, barely reaching 5'4", with messy auburn hair that looked like she had stuck her finger in a plasma conduit. Her clothes, standard issue Academy jumpsuit, hung on her like a deflated space balloon. "Oh, how quaint," whispered Velter, a blue-skinned Altrian whose species had mastered faster-than-light travel before humans had figured out fire. "Look at those tiny limbs. How does it even manipulate complex machinery?" Sarah took her seat in the back row, completely ignoring the symphony of snickers, chittering, and what passed for laughter among the Gorbanian slug people. She pulled out an ancient-looking tablet, the kind that belonged in a museum rather than a classroom, studying advanced quantum mechanics. Professor Keelar cleared all six of his throats simultaneously, a sound like grinding gears mixed with dying cats. "Today, we will be discussing the theoretical limits of consciousness transfer across dimensional barriers, a topic that requires, how do humans say it, big brain energy." More laughter, because apparently making fun of species-specific limitations never got old in academic circles. "Now then," Keelar continued, his four eyes gleaming with malicious glee, "who can tell me the minimum neural complexity required for stable dimensional consciousness bridging?" Tentacles shot up. Crystalline appendages waggled enthusiastically. Even the metatherin gas being managed to condense itself into what might charitably be called a raised hand. Keeler's gaze swept the room like a predator selecting prey. "Miss Blackthorne, since you are our special guest, why don't you enlighten us with human wisdom?" Sarah looked up from her tablet, blinking slowly. "Are you seriously asking me to solve a problem your species has been working on for 3,000 years? The room fell silent. Not the good kind of silent. The kind of silence that happened right before someone got launched out of an airlock. "Well," Keeler's voice rose 3 octaves, "if the primitive species find the question too challenging—" "Oh, no, it's not challenging," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying that particular human quality of being simultaneously bored and dangerous. "It's just that you are approaching it completely wrong. You could have heard a photon drop." Velter leaned forward, his 4 nostrils flaring with indignation. "Excuse me? Our species has been studying dimensional mechanics since before your planet had multicellular life." "Yeah, about that," Sarah said, standing up and walking toward the front of the class with the casual confidence of someone who owned the room but had not bothered to mention it yet. "You've been studying it. We've been doing it." The metatherin being condensed so quickly created a small sonic boom. "Impossible. Consciousness transfer requires neural networks of at least 47 trillion synaptic connections." Sarah reached the professor's podium and turned to face the class. "Does it now? That's interesting because—" She raised her right hand, palm facing the stunned audience. At first, they saw nothing, just a human hand, slightly calloused, with short, trimmed nails and what appeared to be some kind of marking on the palm. Then the marking began to glow, not metaphorically, not figuratively, actually literally, physically glow with a soft blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something none of them could quite identify. "What in the 17 hells of Ortana is that?" breathed a crystalline student whose name was an unpronounceable series of harmonic frequencies. The glow intensified, and suddenly the air above Sarah's palm began to shift. Reality bent, space folded, and through the impossible tear in the dimensional fabric, another hand reached through, an identical hand, attached to an identical arm, belonging to an identical Sarah, who stepped through the dimensional rift like she was walking through a particularly ordinary doorway. "Hi, everyone," said Sarah number 2, waving cheerfully at the class full of aliens whose collective jaws had hit the floor so hard they had probably cracked the foundation. "Sorry I am late. Traffic in Dimension 7C is absolutely murder this time of day. The first Sarah grinned. Class, meet my sister. Well, technically she's me, but from a parallel dimension where I decided to major in theoretical physics instead of practical applications. Practical applications, the second Sarah corrected. Of theoretical impossibilities. Professor Keeler's 6 arms began trembling. All of them. Simultaneously. This is you can't just... Can't just what? Both Saras asked in perfect unison. Can't just casually demonstrate technology that your species considers theoretically impossible? Can't just prove that humans have been hopping between dimensions for fun while you've been writing academic papers about why it cannot be done? The room erupted in chaos. Not the fun kind of chaos. The existential crisis-inducing kind of chaos. Impossible. Velter shrieked, his blue skin cycling through 17 different shades of purple. The energy requirements alone would require a star. Sarah held up her hand again. The tattoo pulsed once, twice, and suddenly 6 more versions of herself stepped through dimensional rifts that opened like flowers blooming in fast forward. Actually, said Sarah 3, it only requires about as much energy as a decent cup of coffee, which, fun fact, is what powered the first successful test. Caffeine, added Sarah 4, turns out to be one of the fundamental forces of the universe. Who knew? Sarah 5 was carrying what appeared to be a clipboard. I have been documenting this conversation across 47 different dimensional variants. In 39 of them, Professor Keelar faints. In 6, he tries to dissect one of us for science. In 2, he offers us his job. What happens in the remaining ones? Asked a tentacle student whose voice sounded like wet leather being dragged across broken glass. Sarah 6 smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was a kind of smile that suggested she knew things, terrible things, things that would keep you awake at night wondering why humans were allowed to exist in the first place. In the remaining dimensions, he asked the smart question. Professor Keelar, all 6 of his hands now gripping his desk so tightly his knuckles had gone translucent, managed to croak. What is the smart question? The smart question, said Sarah 7, materializing directly behind him because apparently personal space was just another law of physics humans felt free to ignore, is not how we do it. It is not why we do it, continued Sarah 8, appearing in the middle of the classroom in a shower of sparks that definitely violated several fire safety regulations. The smart question, said original Sarah, her tattoo now pulsing with enough light to serve as emergency illumination, is why we are showing you. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a kind of silence that happened when an entire room full of supposedly superior alien intelligences suddenly realized they might have made a tiny, insignificant mistake. Like assuming humans were primitive. Like assuming they knew everything about consciousness transfer. Like assuming the small, unremarkable human in the back row was just another exchange student instead of living proof that their entire understanding of reality needed some serious updates. Velter was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than the dignified baritone he was known for. Why? Why are you showing us? All 8 Saras turned to look at him, and their synchronized movement was somehow more unsettling than any of the impossible physics they had just demonstrated. Because, they said in perfect unison, your graduation exam is in 3 days. And... prompted the Gorbanian slug person, whose species communicated primarily through releasing chemical pheromones that currently smelled like existential dread mixed with burning electronics. And, said Sarah 1 as the other 7 versions of herself began stepping back through their respective dimensional rifts, the final exam question is going to be, demonstrate practical consciousness transfer across dimensional barriers. The last thing the class saw before the rifts closed was 8 identical smiles that seemed to suggest the universe had a sense of humor after all. Unfortunately, the punchline was going to be their final grades. ## part 2. As the last dimensional tear sealed itself with sound like reality's sighing in relief, original Sarah walked back to her seat, sat down, and returned to her ancient tablet as if she had not just casually redefined several fundamental laws of physics. Any questions? She asked without looking up. The response was the sound of 56 different species, trying very hard not to hyperventilate in their respective atmospheric requirements. Professor Keelar stood frozen at his podium, all 6 arms still gripping the desk, staring at the spot where reality had been casually violated multiple times in the span of 5 minutes. "Miss Blackthorne," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. What exactly is that tattoo?" Sarah looked up from her tablet, and for the first time since entering the classroom, she smiled. Not the terrifying interdimensional smile, just a regular human, slightly amused smile that somehow managed to be even more unsettling. "Oh, this old thing?" She glanced at her palm, where the blue glow was fading back to what appeared to be an intricate geometric pattern. "It's my student ID." Silence. "Your student ID?" "Yeah. Every human gets one when they are accepted into the Galactic exchange program. Standard procedure. The tattoo contains our dimensional coordinates, consciousness backup, emergency contact information across 17 different realities, and..." She paused, apparently checking something on her tablet. "Oh, looks like mine also has the lunch menu from the cafeteria in Dimension 12B. Their pizza is amazing." A sound escaped from the collective student body that could best be described as the noise 46 different vocal cords make when their owners realize they've been playing checkers while their opponent has been playing 4-dimensional chess with pieces that do not technically exist. "The entire human exchange program," Belter said slowly, his 4 eyes wide enough to serve as emergency landing pads, "consists of interdimensional travelers?" "Well, obviously," Sarah replied, as if this should have been apparent to anyone with functioning brain cells. "How else do you think we keep up with the academic requirements? Do you have any idea how fast you people talk? We need at least 7 versions of ourselves just to take notes properly." The crystalline student made a noise like wind chimes being fed through a wood chipper. But the energy costs, the theoretical framework, the computational requirements for stable dimensional bridging." Sarah sighed, the patient sigh of someone explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "Look, I get that you are all very smart and have spent centuries working out the math, but sometimes you just have to try stuff and see what happens. Humans are really good at the trying stuff part." "You mean to tell me," Professor Keelar said, his voice rising with each word, "that your species achieved practical dimensional travel through trial and error?" "Well, trial and error, and a really good cup of coffee. Also, we may have accidentally blown up a small moon during the early experiments, but that is just the price of scientific progress." The Gorbanian slug person released a pheromone cloud that smelled like burning mathematics textbooks. "Don't worry," Sarah added helpfully. "It was mostly uninhabited. There were just some space pirates using it as a base, and honestly, they had it coming." 46 alien species stared at the human who had just casually mentioned committing casual genocide in the pursuit of dimensional travel technology and realized that maybe, just maybe, they had severely underestimated exactly how dangerous humans could be when they put their minds to something, especially when that something involved rewriting the fundamental laws of reality because they were bored on a Tuesday. The rest of the class passed in a stunned silence, broken only by the occasional sound of alien students having minor nervous breakdowns and Professor Keelar muttering equations under his breath like a mathematical mantra designed to restore his faith in a rational universe. As the session ended and students began filing out, Sarah packed up her ancient tablet and headed for the door. "Miss Blackthorne," Professor Keelar called after her, his voice cracking slightly. "The final exam. You were serious about the consciousness transfer demonstration." Sarah paused at the doorway and turned back with that same terrifying human smile. "Professor, I am always serious about my grades. See you in 3 days." She left, and the remaining students could have sworn they heard her humming what sounded suspiciously like funeral music as her footsteps echoed down the corridor. Professor Keelar looked around his empty classroom at the scorch marks on the floor where reality had been casually violated and came to a profound realization. He was definitely going to need a stronger drink, possibly from another dimension. 3 days later, the examination hall looked like a war zone, preparing for battle. 46 alien species had spent 72 hours in various states of panic, desperately trying to crack the secrets of consciousness transfer that they now realize humans have been casually using like a subway system. The Vexonian Medical Bay had treated 17 cases of stress-induced molting. The Alterian dormitories reeked of anxiety pheromones, so strong they had to install industrial air filters. Even the notoriously calm metatheran gas beings had condensed into tight, nervous spheres that rolled around campus like tumbleweeds of existential crisis. Professor Keelar stood at the examination podium, looking like he had spent the past 3 days wrestling with equations that actively fought back. His 6 arms trembled as he held the test parameters, and his 4 eyes were bloodshot from too much research and not enough sleep. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities," he announced, his voice carrying all the enthusiasm of a funeral director reading out particularly grim obituaries. "Welcome to your final examination in advanced dimensional mechanics." Velter raised one of his 4 hands, which was shaking so badly it looked like he was trying to flag down a particularly elusive taxi. "Professor, surely you cannot be serious about requiring us to demonstrate practical consciousness transfer? The theoretical framework alone would require—" "Oh, spare me the theoretical framework lecture," interrupted a familiar voice from the back of the hall. Sarah Blackthorne strolled in, looking remarkably refreshed for someone who had spent the weekend presumably bending reality to her will. "You people really need to learn the difference between overthinking and actually thinking." She was carrying what appeared to be a coffee cup, a perfectly ordinary, completely unremarkable coffee cup that somehow managed to radiate an aura of barely contained cosmic horror. "Miss Blackthorne," Professor Keelar said, all 6 of his hands now gripping his podium like it was the last solid thing in a universe gone mad. "You seem remarkably calm for someone about to take an examination in consciousness transfer." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and shrugged. "Well, I figure I should probably explain how this whole thing actually works before you all have nervous breakdowns trying to reinvent interdimensional travel in 72 hours. The Gorbanian slug person released a pheromone cloud that smelled like desperate hope mixed with lingering terror. "You mean you're going to help us?" "Help is a strong word," Sarah replied, setting her coffee cup down on the nearest desk. "I prefer to think of it as preventing mass casualties through education." She walked in front of the hall, and 46 different species held their respective breaths. "Right then," Sarah said, clapping her hands together. "Who wants to know the first rule of human interdimensional travel?" Tentacles shot up. Crystalline appendages waggled desperately. Even the beings who did not technically possess appendages managed to indicate their overwhelming desire to learn whatever cosmic secrets this terrifying human was willing to share. "The first rule," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the weight of revelation, "is that consciousness transfer has nothing to do with consciousness. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when 46 supposedly superior intellects simultaneously experience cognitive overload." "I beg your pardon?" Professor Keelar managed to croak. "Consciousness transfer is a terrible name for what we actually do," Sarah explained, beginning to pace back and forth like a professor delivering a lecture on the fundamentals of reality. "We do not transfer consciousness. We transfer information, very specific information. But the neural complexity requirements," Velter protested, his 4 nostrils flared with confusion, "the synaptic mapping, the quantum entanglement protocols." "Yeah, about that," Sarah said, pulling out her ancient tablet and tapping a few times. "You have been trying to move the entire consciousness, which is like trying to transport an entire library when all you really need is one specific book." The air above her tablet shimmered, and suddenly a holographic display appeared, showing what looked like a simplified human brain diagram. "Human consciousness," she continued, pointing at various highlighted regions, "is incredibly efficient at information compression. We do not store everything. We store references." "References?" asked the crystalline student, whose harmonic voice sounded like a confused wind chime. "Think of it like this," Sarah said, and suddenly the holographic display changed to show what appeared to be a vast library. "Your species thinks consciousness is like having to memorize every single book in this library. Humans figured out that consciousness is just knowing where the books are shelved. The metatheran gas was being condensed slightly, which was probably the equivalent of leaning forward with interest. But how do you maintain continuity of experience across dimensional barriers?" Sarah grinned, and that grin contained enough mischief to power a small star. That brings us to the second rule of human interdimensional travel. We cheat. Cheat. Professor Keeler's voice went up another 3 octaves, which was impressive considering he was already speaking in a range that could shatter glass. Oh, absolutely, Sarah replied cheerfully. We cheat like our lives depend on it, because technically they do. She held up her right hand again, and the tattoo began to glow with that familiar blue light. But this time, instead of opening dimensional rifts, the light began forming complex patterns in the air above her palm. This tattoo is not just my student ID, she explained. It is a quantum anchor. It maintains a constant connection to my home dimension, which means I am never actually fully here. 46 alien minds collectively experience what could charitably be called enlightenment, or less charitably be called complete mental breakdown. You mean? Velter said slowly, his voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing cosmic phenomena. You are not actually present in this dimension? Oh, I am about 63% present, Sarah said, checking her tablet as a consultant the weather forecast. The rest of me is distributed across 12 other dimensions, maintaining constant information exchanged through quantum entanglement. The Gorbanian slug person made a sound like air being let out of a very confused balloon. But the energy requirements for maintaining 12 simultaneous dimensional connections, they are surprisingly manageable if you know what you're doing, Sarah interrupted, which brings us to rule number 3. Coffee is not just a beverage. It is a dimensional lubricant. She picked up her coffee cup and took another sip, and as she did, the examination hall briefly flickered, as if reality had hiccuped. Caffeine, she explained, has some very interesting properties when it comes to quantum mechanics. It enhances neural processing speed, reduces dimensional friction, and tastes great with cream and sugar. Professor Keelar stared at the coffee cup like it was a weapon of mass destruction, which, considering the circumstances, it probably was. So, said a tentacled student whose species name was unpronounceable but sounded like wet pasta being thrown against a wall, human interdimensional travel is powered by coffee? Coffee and spite, Sarah confirmed. Mostly spite. Humans are incredibly spiteful creatures, and spite is apparently one of the fundamental forces of the universe. Who knew? This is impossible, muttered the crystalline student. Our calculations show that maintaining stable consciousness across dimensional barriers requires computational power equivalent to a small star. Your calculations, Sarah said gently, assume consciousness is a thing instead of a process. You've been trying to transport a river instead of just following the water. She tapped her tablet again, and the holographic display changed to show what appeared to be a flowing stream of light. Human consciousness is not a solid object that needs to be moved. It is a pattern that can be reproduced, referenced, and maintained across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. But how do you maintain identity continuity? Velter asked, his scientific curiosity finally overcoming his species-wide prejudice against supposedly primitive humans. Easy, Sarah replied. We don't. Another silence. This one felt like the universe holding its breath. I beg your pardon? Professor Keelar whispered. We do not maintain identity continuity in the way you understand it, Sarah explained. Every time I step through a dimensional barrier, I become slightly different. The me that went in is not the same as the me that comes out. But then, how do you remain you? Sarah's smile turned philosophical, which was somehow even more terrifying than her previous expressions. That assumes there was only one me to begin with. The examination hall erupted in the kind of chaos that happens when fundamental assumptions about the nature of individual existence get casually demolished by a human with a coffee addiction. What do you mean? Shrieked 46 different voices in 46 different languages, creating a cacophony that sounded like the universe having an argument with itself. I mean, Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the existential crisis symphony, that the concept of individual identity is a convenient fiction. There are approximately 47,000 versions of me spread across the local dimensional cluster, and we all consider ourselves to be the real Sarah Blackthorne. But that is impossible. Professor Keelar protested. Identity cannot be distributed. Consciousness cannot be shared. Cannot. According to who? Sarah asked. Your theories? Your calculations? Your fundamental assumptions about the nature of individual existence. She gestured around the room at the assembled alien students, all of whom were experiencing various degrees of mental meltdown. Every single one of you is so concerned with maintaining the precious individual identity that you have never considered the possibility that identity itself might be the problem. What do you mean? Asked the Metatheran gas being, who had condensed into what appeared to be a very worried cloud. I mean that the reason humans can do consciousness transfer so easily is that we figured out that consciousness is not individual. It never was. That is just a story we tell ourselves to feel special. Sarah walked over to her coffee cup and took another sip. As she did, the examination hall briefly shimmered, and for just a moment, the assembled students caught glimpses of other versions of the room, other versions of themselves, other versions of reality where this conversation was happening slightly differently. The truth is, Sarah continued, consciousness is a shared phenomenon, a collective process that spans multiple dimensions, multiple realities, multiple versions of existence. Individual identity is just a small part of that process that any given brain can handle at one time. So, when you transfer consciousness, Velter said slowly, his 4 eyes wide with understanding, you are not moving an individual mind. We are adjusting the focus of a multidimensional awareness, Sarah confirmed, like tuning a radio to pick up a different station. Professor Keelar sat down heavily in the nearest chair, all 6 of his arms hanging limply at his sides. The implications of this, everything we thought we knew about consciousness, about identity, about the nature of individual existence, is complete nonsense, Sarah finished cheerfully. But do not feel bad about it. It took humans about 300 years of experimentation to figure it out, and we accidentally destroyed 6 moons and a small asteroid belt in the process. What about the examination? Asked a tentacled student whose voice had taken on the desperate tone of someone clinging to the last shred of familiar reality. Sarah looked around the room at 46 different species, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to terror, to the kind of confused reverence usually reserved for encountering actual deities. Well, she said, I suppose I should probably demonstrate. She held up her hand, and the tattoo began to glow brighter than it had before. But this time, instead of opening rifts or creating holographic displays, the light began to spread. It flowed across her hand, up her arm, across her body, and then outward into the room. When it touched the alien students, they began to glow as well. What is happening? Professor Keelar asked, his voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. I am sharing the connection, Sarah explained, and her voice now seemed to come from everywhere at once, temporarily linking your individual consciousnesses to the multidimensional awareness network. Suddenly, every student in the room could feel it, the presence of thousands, millions, billions of other minds across countless dimensions. The vast, interconnected web of consciousness that spanned realities like an infinite neural network. They could sense other versions of themselves in other dimensions, making different choices, living different lives, but all fundamentally connected to the same underlying awareness. For 46 different species, it was the most terrifying and beautiful experience of their existence. This, Sarah said, her voice now harmonized with voices from across the dimensional spectrum, is what human interdimensional travel actually is. Not moving consciousness, but expanding it, not transferring identity, but recognizing that identity was always an illusion. The connection lasted exactly 37 seconds. Then the light faded and 46 alien students found themselves back in their individual minds, in their individual bodies, in their individual realities. But they were no longer quite the same individuals they had been 38 seconds earlier. Professor Keelar looked around the room at his students, all of whom were sitting in stunned silence, processing an experience that had fundamentally changed their understanding of existence itself. Miss Blackthorne, he said quietly, what mark should I give you for this examination? Sarah, who was now back to being just one person in one dimension with one perfectly ordinary coffee cup, shrugged. I will leave that up to you, Professor. But I should probably mention that every human exchange student in the Galactic Academy system just shared that same demonstration simultaneously across 47 different dimensions. What does that mean? Sarah grinned one last time, and it was a grin that contained the promise of a universe far stranger and more wonderful than any of them had ever imagined. It means your final grades are going to be very interesting to calculate. She picked up her tablet, finished her coffee, and walked toward the exit. Oh, and Professor? Yes. Next semester, you might want to consider updating your curriculum. You are about 300 years behind on consciousness theory. She left, and the examination hall fell silent, except for the sound of 46 different species trying to process the fact that everything they thought they knew about reality had just been casually rewritten by a human with a coffee addiction and a talent for interdimensional travel. Professor Keelar looked at his empty classroom, at the lingering traces of quantum energy in the air, and at the examination papers that would now require him to grade experiences that transcended the very concept of individual achievement. He reached for his communicator and composed a message to the Academy administration. Request immediate review of the Human Exchange Program. Also, request a psychiatric evaluation for the faculty. Also, request stronger coffee in the faculty lounge. Much stronger coffee. As he sent the message, he could swear he heard the sound of laughter echoing from multiple dimensions. It sounded suspiciously like 47,000 versions of Sarah Blackthorne, all enjoying the same cosmic joke. The punchline, apparently, was the entire concept of individual existence. And somewhere in the multidimensional awareness network that connected all conscious beings across all realities, the universe itself was laughing along. Subscribe and like to my channel for more HFY sci-fi stories.